Hi everyone, it's John. It's Wednesday. I've been away for a few weeks, but I hope everyone's having a good 2019. Uh, 9 days so far that we're into it. And I'm here with another book review today, as usual. Something a little bit different, a biography, which I guess isn't that different, but more of a popular one. This is going to be a review of Eleanor of Aquitaine, A Life. At least that's the way. Is A Life on there on this version? I don't know. That's the way it's listed on Goodreads. So, by Alison Weir. The A Life might just be in the UK edition. I don't know. But Fran Lebowitz, the famous New York wit and raconteur, points out that Jane Austen enjoys such perennial popularity because she is, in the minds of much of her contemporary readership, which seems to be teenage girls these days, or young women in their 20s. She's considered to be a Victorian writer, which is really interesting because rarely do we stop to think that Jane Austen was actually born in 1817, which was exactly 20 years to the year before Queen Victoria ever took the throne from her uncle, William IV. So we think of her in sort of an anachronistic way. In much the same way, I think that those of us who are somewhat familiar with the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine rarely stop to think about when she lived. About 20 years ago, when I first saw that wonderful movie, which I highly recommend to everyone, by the name of The Lion in Winter, starring Katharine Hepburn in the role of Eleanor of Aquitaine, she says in response to her son John, of course he has a knife. He always has a knife. We all have knives. It's 1183 and we're barbarians. And I thought to myself, wow, 1183, did she really live that long ago? I mean, okay, 1583, 1483, and I mean, I was, in high school at the time. I knew she lived a long time ago, but 1183, that is almost 900 years ago. And, well, I guess it's closer to 8, but it's over 800 years ago. And I thought to myself, was it really that early? And looked her up online, and it was. It really was that early. So, I mean, barring the obvious problematic presentism of that quote, thinking that everyone was a barbarian in 1183, it does really remind us that we're dealing with a personality who's very, very much removed from us in time. And depending on the historical source you believe, Eleanor was born in either 1122 or 1124. So, before we embark on reading a biography of someone who lived this long ago, it's good to take a little bit of perspective and to step back and to think about her life, the place of women 9 centuries ago, and how long ago her birth was, 1122 or 1124. Just for a little bit of perspective, Galileo was as removed from her life as we are from Galileo's. He's pretty much perfect, and his date of birth is pretty much perfectly between today and her date of birth. He's right in between. It's remarkable to think that we know enough about his life, and really absolutely extraordinary to think that we can even begin to write a biography of a woman whose 900th anniversary we'll soon be able to celebrate. So, now that we sort of have her age and her historical distance behind us, we can get into the meat of the review. This is the first Alison Weir biography I've ever read. She is, however, a very, very popular biographer. You've probably read other things by her. Let's see. What other things has she written? The Six Wives of Henry VIII, The Princes in the Tower, the children of Henry VIII. She's written a biography of Elizabeth I, a book on Mary, Queen of Scots, and the murder of Lord Darnley, a biography of Queen Isabella, and probably other things. This was printed 20 years ago, so I'm sure she's written even more in the interim. But a very popular and pretty accomplished biographer. But a popular one, much more popular than books I usually sort of review on this channel. Still seem to be a perfectly serviceable book for a biography for the average reader with maybe little to no background in medieval history, which is probably the audience for the book. That having been said, I'm not sure you're going to find a lot of groundbreaking material here. Thankfully, it also means that you won't be subject to the near ubiquitous claims found in contemporary biographies about how the author has been allowed exclusive access into this archive or whatever else. Almost everything that we know about Eleanor, with very few exceptions, has been known for centuries, simply because of how long she's been dead. And what remains to be filled out, of course, with a project like this would just be context. That is, what you want to sort of bring into the foreground and leave in the background, and also the imagination of the biographer. For the fullest and richest account of Eleanor's life, I think you should maybe watch this, or read this rather, in tandem with watching The Lion in Winter, which manages to be not only really well acted and perfectly cast, with Peter O'Toole in the role of Henry II, and, as I mentioned, Katharine Hepburn in the role of Eleanor, but also fairly historically accurate, with maybe the possible exceptions of Richard being gay and Geoffrey dying in a jousting tournament, neither of which we're completely sure of. The film focuses in on mostly Eleanor's marriage to Henry, but does sort of bring in some relations with the French. But this book really covers the whole arc of her life. Of course, her first marriage, which was with Louis, and it really was an adventurous life. So at the age of 15, Eleanor is married off to Louis VII, who goes by Louis the Young, with whom she actually went to Jerusalem with during the Second Crusade, excuse me. That was a trip that turned out to be really an unmitigated failure. And Weir, for some reason, really goes out of her way to describe the sort of outlandish and extravagant retinue of property and servants and animals and people that Eleanor took with her during the voyage. Almost a cumbersome entourage. But after a 15-year-long marriage that only produced 2 daughters, and the Middle Ages has its upsides, I guess, but having a marriage with only daughters is not one of them. She managed to wrangle an annulment from the Pope, and then almost immediately married Henry, the Duke of Normandy, who 2 years later would become Henry II. Her marriage was more successful than the first one because it produced 8 children instead of just 2. And, of course, 2 of those children went on to become kings of England, Richard I, the so-called Lion-Hearted, and King John. But as the marriage wore on, Henry became increasingly brash about sleeping with other women, which might have had a role to play in her supporting her sons when they tried to oust their father from his throne in 1173. And for her role in the insurrection, she would spend the next 16 years, that is, until Henry's death in 1189, basically locked up in a castle so as to control her troublemaking. Despite her advanced age, when Henry died and she was released, she was 67 at the time, which was, by the way, practically an unheard of age for anyone to reach back then. She would even though she would go on to live for more than another decade, all the while continuing to exert really considerable influence over both English and French politics. The English and French, just for a tiny bit of historical perspective, after the Norman invasion of England and the Norman conquer of England in 1066, France and English diplomacy and relations became much more intertwined, and the English and French aristocracies became sort of incestuous. Today, of course, we think of England and France as two completely separate countries, but historically, especially when their monarchies were much more powerful and established 800, 900, 1,000 years ago, they were, when you think of Normans and Normandy invading and conquering England, that Normandy is still a part of France. So that's the part of France that conquered England in the Norman invasion. So that's why they have such a close historical connection, and did have one for hundreds of years. So she, like I said, she would go on to live for over another decade after she was released from the castle. In her last couple of years of life, around 1202, never having quite quit public life, she retired to Fontevraud Abbey and died there in 1204, next to Henry, who kept her imprisoned for half their marriage, and her son, Richard the Lighthearted. Eleanor is sometimes too easily tossed off with biographies that have quips like, she was an influential woman, she was the wife of 2 kings and the mother of still 2 more kings. And while this is true, it's sort of lazy and it's kind of misogynistic, defining her life in the terms of the accomplishments of her sons and her husbands. The truth is that Eleanor, completely on her own terms, exerted a resounding influence on almost every sphere of her life at a time when women were almost exclusively pushed to the sidelines and seen for the contents of their uterus and for the value of their dowry only. Weir's biography goes some way in trying to create an inner life for Eleanor and filling out her motivations and feelings and sentiments, carefully consulting historical records, and the source material is impressive and rigorous considering the more popular nature of the intended audience, and where possible, being otherwise pretty judicious in her interpretations. I don't think she's outlandishly filling in any spaces in Eleanor's life where she doesn't really have some good evidence to think that what she said didn't happen. I'd be curious to read other more scholarly biographies of Eleanor, especially considering, at least according to Weir's biography, that she was really one of the first major proponents and supporters of the art of courtly love at the palace of one of their palaces, which is where the art of courtly love and the art of being a troubadour was actually first established. If not more scholarly biographies, at least more information about that, and maybe even more popular biographies too. I need to go rewatch The Lion in Winter. That is such a great movie. It's been years since I've watched it, and if this biography sounds interesting to you at all, or Henry II's life, or Eleanor's life sounds interesting, definitely go watch that movie. The Lion in Winter, Katharine Hepburn, Peter O'Toole, just really, really, really great stuff. But the book is certainly not bad either. Not a bad place to start. For Eleanor of Aquitaine by Alison Weir. Bye, guys. See you next week.